Coming up with a top 25 list of my all-time favorite films was hard, and coming up with a top 100 was nearly impossible. I didn't think I had watched enough films to make the list, but after scouring through my DVD and Blu-ray collection, going through my Amazon wishlist and iTunes collection, I was somehow able to call some of the most entertaining and influential films of my time. Keep in mind, ranking so many films just isn't possible without individually going through each one and saying, this film is better than that one. Even then, it would be an unmanageable feat, because upon rewatches, my opinion changes. You'll notice that as I get closer to my top 25, a lot of that list has changed, with a lot of my original picks moving much further down the list. Also, I'm warning you, you're going to question a lot of my picks, and that's okay. If I was doing the top 100 films of all time, there'd be no point. All you have to do is check out IMDb or the AFI's Top 100 Movies lists, and you'll be all set. I realize that some of these movies aren't great, but I find them extremely entertaining, and they get better with each watch. For example, I think Francis Coppola's The Godfather is a truly great film. It might even be one of the few cinematic masterpieces, but no matter how many times I've watched it, I still feel it's a bit overrated, and at the end of the day, it isn't a very fun movie.
You spend time with your family?
Sure I do.
Good. Because a man that doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man.
It's very quotable, the directing and acting are amazing, and Marlon Brando deserves most of the kudos he got for that film.
I was about to come up and wake you just now and tell you.
But you needed a drink first.
Yeah.
And now you've had your drink.
But it just never completely stuck with me for one reason or another. It's just a personal thing. That doesn't mean this list is going to be all about big Hollywood blockbusters either. There are going to be a lot of films on here from all genres that have made hundreds of top 10s, top 100s, whatever. Basically, this is just my personal list. These are the films that I couldn't live without. It's never going to be definite, the list will always be changing, especially as new movies come out year after year. But just know a lot of thought went into this list, and it's fun to just discuss these movies, even if a lot of them are pretty questionable. So here we go, my top 100 favorite films. Number 100.
Would you hurry up? Okay.
When I was in film school, each of us had to pick a specific director to analyze, and I chose Wes Craven, mainly because I was very familiar with the Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream films, but I hadn't seen his earlier work. I actually rented Last House while I was on a date, and needless to say, this is not a film you want to watch when trying to make a first impression. The film makes no excuses, with tons of gore and horrific imagery. It's very haunting. A group of escaped convicts, led by Krug, entrap two innocent girls, then proceed to torture and rape them. Unlike most of the slashers from the 80s, which were more comedic in tone, a lot of these 70s horror films were gritty and relentless. I'd put this on the same plane as Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Both movies have a very similar documentary feel, and you feel dirty watching them because you feel like you're actually in that situation, a voyeur, forced to watch these events unfold. Last House is a true horror film in every sense of the word. The scariest thing about it, though, is it isn't about an unstoppable killer or some supernatural device. This is the kind of story you hear about on the 7 o'clock news. These kinds of stories happen all the time, and if you're a parent, it's even scarier. As parents, we can't be there all the time to protect our kids, and this movie taps into that. It's even more disturbing that the bad things happening to these girls are juxtaposed with the birthday party the parents are preparing for their daughter. It isn't a perfect film. The cinematography is rough, and there are some cheesy comedic elements with these two bumbling police officers that take me out of the movie.
Fasten your seatbelt!
But it's a truly vicious and unforgiving horror film that gets under my skin every time I watch it. Number 99. This was one of those films I heard about in grade school and just passed it off as someone pulling my leg. It seemed too hokey to be real. Then I actually saw it play on cable. There are low-budget movies that get by merely with their titles, but then never deliver what that title suggests. With Killer Clowns, the Chiodo brothers deliver in spades. Taking its cues from the alien invasion movies of the 50s, a small town is invaded by killer clowns. Even though the clowns are clearly aliens, the filmmakers went out of their way to make sure everything the clowns use feels, well, clown-like. Their spaceship is in the shape of a carnival tent. They kill people with flesh-eating popcorn. They turn their victims into cotton candy.
Nobody stores cotton candy like this.
And they even use balloon dogs to track down their prey. It's so incredibly goofy and yet such a blast to watch. The lead characters are all very likable, the clown makeup is fantastic, and the climax is well worth it.
Yeah.
Take it easy. Keep your shirt on.
Don't worry, we intend to.
It's a cult favorite, and not a bad one to start with if you're just getting into horror films. It's one of the pinnacle horror comedies of the 80s, and it's just as watchable today as it was back then. Number 98. A remake of Roger Corman's original 1960 film, Rick Moranis leads an all-star cast as Seymour Krelborn, a florist who stumbles upon a weird plant.
Seymour, where did you get such a weird plant?
In a sci-fi twist, it turns out that the plant will only grow by drinking blood and eventually eating people.
Feed me, Krelborn! Feed me now!
The plant, which Seymour names Audrey 2 after his love interest, garners a lot of business for the store and catapults Seymour to superstardom, but as the creature's appetite grows, Seymour starts to feel the guilt of all the people he's fed to the plant. The musical numbers steal the show here.
You'll be a dentist. You have a talent for causing things.
Although admittedly, a lot of them are pretty cheesy, but I also think that's the nature of most musicals. The effects in Audrey 2 are fantastic, and Levi Stubbs does an excellent job providing the voice.
No shit, Sherlock.
It's a thrill to watch. But the one thing that stands out in my mind, the one thing that left a permanent impression, is the film's ending. If you saw this movie in the 80s, you remember the ending, right? Seymour kills Audrey 2, then moves to a beautiful house with Audrey as his wife. Well, director Frank Oz actually filmed a different ending that was ultimately dropped when it scored badly with test audiences. The original ending, which was restored in the 2012 DVD release, has Seymour feed Audrey's dead corpse to the plant, then has the plant eat Seymour, before we're treated to this huge finale where a bunch of Audrey 2s are destroying the world. It's really creepy, and while it is effective, it's just such a different tone from the rest of the film. Honestly, as cool as I think this ending is, it left me feeling really depressed because I really grew to like these characters. It's very divisive, but that could also be what makes it great. Number 97. I saw an episode of Taxi when I was a kid. I don't remember anything about the show other than the foreign-speaking mechanic Latka Gravis.
Let's hear it. I love a good joke.
Ok. Di ba nito si vede ka siya bole ki si pili ko levi. Wala sa to levi si ne bote ki niya ba. Tama tutti bili ko.
I remember wondering, what's the deal with this guy, and does he actually talk like that in real life? I had no idea who Andy Kaufman was until Milos Forman released his biopic in 1999. I didn't even know the movie was based on a real person until they started reenacting scenes from Taxi.
And they want to turn him into a lovable, goofy mechanic named... Latka.
Then it hit me. I was never a big Jim Carrey fan, with the exception of the Ace Ventura films, but given that he was supposed to be playing a more dramatic role, maybe that was what intrigued me about it when I saw it in theaters. In my high school days, I was socially awkward, having no idea how to connect with people and how to make people laugh. Man on the Moon blew me away because it seemed like Andy had the same problem.
Your act is like amateur hour. You're doing sing-alongs for 6-year-olds, puppets that aren't funny, playing records.
As a kid, he would put on shows for imaginary audiences, and even in his adult years, he seemed to enjoy entertaining himself more than the crowd. If you research Kaufman's career, he spent a lot of time intentionally failing, getting a rise out of offending and pissing off his audience rather than making them laugh. He always described himself as a song and dance man, rather than a straight-up comedian, and he often personified this under the guise of the foul-mouthed, obnoxious lounge singer Tony Clifton.
Whoop, hey, look out, I think you're starting some cottage cheese. Oh, pardon me, that's your ass.
Watching Jim Carrey in this role, even knowing nothing about the real-life Andy Kaufman, I got a sense that I was actually watching the real person. Whenever an A-list actor portrays an actual historical figure or celebrity, there's a fine balancing act between merely imitating that person and embodying who that person was. All you have to do is watch the documentary Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond to realize just how far Carrey was willing to go to embody Kaufman. Even Kaufman's real-life friends, Danny DeVito and Lynn Margulies, stated that while they worked with Carrey on the film, it was as if they were getting to reunite with their long-lost friend, and it was a really emotional experience for them. The film has a unique history behind it, but it's also just an entertaining movie, and unlike a lot of Andy's real-life stunts, the film lets us in on some of the gags, such as when Andy wrestles with real-life wrestler Jerry Lawler. The cherry on the topping is the film's ending. It's not difficult to figure out, especially if you know the history behind Kaufman's death, and the fact that when he passed, a lot of people, including Kaufman's friends and relatives, thought he might have faked it. But I did know people who didn't understand the ending, and thankfully, this is one of those rare occasions when it's left a little ambiguous, and I still got the meaning behind it. Number 96. Michael Bay has become something of a running joke amongst critics, either accused of stealing from more talented filmmakers or simply crushing our childhoods with a series of horror remakes and live-action adaptations of cherished cartoons. Everyone seems to bash him for his endless Transformers movies, and even his older films like Armageddon and Pearl Harbor, which I think are both fine, don't seem to escape scrutiny. But the one Michael Bay film I never hear anyone talk about is The Island. Maybe that's because it's actually pretty good. It revolves around a society that is kept and monitored underground because of a worldwide calamity that has made Earth's surface uninhabitable. The one place you can go is the island, uncontaminated from the atomic fallout, but the only way to get there is by winning the lottery. At least, that's what everyone's being told. It's all a clever ruse to keep everyone under control, with Sean Bean as the mastermind behind a much larger and ultimately horrifying revelation. With this film, it seems like Bay again stole from a fine talent pool, most notably George Lucas's THX 1138 and the Wachowskis' Matrix films. It could almost be a continuation of THX, but whereas Lucas's futuristic tone poem never actually reveals what's going on behind the scenes, The Island reveals everything during the second act, when the two leads, Lincoln and Jordan, make their escape into the real world and they finally realize the truth behind the illusion.
I mean, you're human, but you're not real.
It's a Michael Bay film, so suffice to say, there's a lot of action set pieces, but I never feel like I'm being overwhelmed by fast car chases or explosions. The action is suspenseful and always seems to move the story forward, which is what a good action scene is supposed to do. I also like a lot of the supporting characters. Everyone living in the society has an innocent, almost infant-like quality to them, and it's fun watching them learn the simplest things, even though you have a pretty good idea of what's going on, at least on the surface.
Dude.
Dude? Huh? What does it mean?
I don't know, he just called me dude.
Hey, dude. He said, hey, dude?
Hey, dude. D-O-O-D. Dude.
Hey, dude.
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 Yeah, dude.
When Lincoln, played by Ewan McGregor, starts questioning a lot of things going on around him, his inquisitive nature starts to spread like the plague, with more of his acquaintances beginning to question their surroundings, putting a dent in Sean Bean's plans. To spoil the illusion here would be a disservice to the movie, but it's one of McGregor's most memorable roles, not to mention one hell of an action flick that shouldn't be set aside like the rest of Michael Bay's catalog. Number 95. This past October, I started digging into Universal's back catalog of monster classics, and honestly, most of the ones I've seen thus far have been pretty good. But when it comes to movies that stand out to me, Bride of Frankenstein feels special. I first saw this film a couple years ago, and even before my rewatch, I remembered specific moments, like Dr. Pretorius' little people in jars, as well as the sequence where the monster meets the old blind man in the woods. The film was directed by James Whale, who aside from directing the first Frankenstein, also helmed the 1933 Universal classic, The Invisible Man, both of which are two of the funniest movies in the Universal monster catalog. I don't mean that it's a comedy, it's just as suspenseful as the first film, but there are a lot of funny moments that break up the tension. Just watching Boris Karloff attempt to speak as the monster adds a level of warmth to the film, and it's the first time I can recall actually feeling sympathy toward the monster. I was definitely reminded of The Toxic Avenger. In that film, the monster hero is hideously deformed and is misunderstood by the townspeople at first. The monster, Melvin, hooks up with a girl later in the film, and because she's blind, she's able to look past his physical deformity. All I'm saying is this movie's influence stretches everywhere, even into the far reaches of Troma. I especially love Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius. He works as a counter to Colin Clive's Henry Frankenstein. While Henry in many ways is a tragic character, simply testing out a scientific theory and ultimately failing for his efforts, Dr. Pretorius is truly maniacal, using the monster's hatred of Frankenstein to meet his own goals.
I've changed my mind. I won't do it. I expected this.
One other standout performance I'd like to point out is Una O'Connor as Minnie. I don't know what it is about her or why she was even chosen to act in a film that is usually pretty somber in tone, because she really sticks out like a sore thumb. But somehow I loved every minute. Unlike the rest of the cast who plays their role straight, O'Connor is at a constant 11. She plays a similar character in The Invisible Man, and she was a little too much to handle in that one, but here I find she adds the right amount of goofiness, even if it is a little out of place. Surprisingly, I actually had a lot to say about this one, but it introduces us to one of the most popular movie monsters of all time, and for being a sequel to one of the most famous horror films ever, it delivers on all accounts. Number 94. This is one of those rare gems you accidentally run across at the local video store, not knowing what to expect until you take it home and pop it in. I'll admit the thing that caught my interest was the director, Bob Gale, who wrote all of the Back to the Future films. I also noticed it had a killer cast with James Marsden, Gary Oldman, Amy Smart, Christopher Lloyd, Chris Cooper, Kurt Russell, Michael J. Fox, and Amy Jo Johnson. For a film that went pretty much unnoticed, that's pretty incredible. The film kind of plays out like a modern Wizard of Oz. Neil Oliver, a struggling artist, is being pressured to become a lawyer like his father, who even gets him an interview with his law firm. During a birthday party, Neil encounters the whimsical O.W. Grant, played by Gary Oldman, a trickster who plays pranks on people. Essentially, he is the Americanized version of a leprechaun. When he asks Neil to make a wish, Neil wishes for an answer to his life, which leads him to an imaginary road, Interstate 60. What follows is an adventure in which Neil, charged with delivering a package for Christopher Lloyd's character, encounters all sorts of crazy characters who will play a part in Neil's journey. To be fair, none of these people are really essential in Neil finding answers, and by the end of the film, the only conclusion we really come to is that Neil needs to make his own decisions. Pretty lame, right? It's true, the movie can be overly quirky, and I've even heard some critics call the film pretentious, but the enjoyment for me just comes from all the characters Neil meets on his journey. They don't necessarily relate to Neil's goal, but they also provide little nuggets of truth that make you think. Probably the most profound part of the film is where Neil meets Bob Cody, a cancer victim who claims to be suicidal, and he goes completely nuts whenever he realizes someone's lying to him. Like everyone else, he's more of a caricature, but the speech he gives Neil about the frontier is really thought-provoking.
What about space? The final frontier?
Star Trek isn't space. That's television. Fine fucking frontier that is.
I know some also take issue with Neil just being an unlikable character from the start. At the beginning of the film, Neil's dad buys him a red convertible for his birthday, which Neil dismisses because he doesn't like the color. It sounds like something a snobby rich kid would do, but the scene works for me because it's not that he doesn't appreciate the car. He just doesn't like the fact that his dad buys him something he would normally buy for himself. Neil points out that the license plate even has his dad's catchphrase embossed on it. I can further argue this because when his sister later gives him paintbrushes as her gift, he's eccentric. So he's not an unlikable character in my eyes, he's just not afraid to admit what he really wants out of life, and if anything, it makes him even more humble. Going back to the characters Neil meets along the way, they all leave an impression. Amy Jo Johnson makes a memorable appearance as a promiscuous girl looking for a good time.
Let me take care of that, baby.
which was shocking when you remember she played Kimberly in the original Power Rangers. He also visits a town called Morlaw, which is pretty much a no-brainer. Get it? His dad wants him to be a lawyer. More law? Moving on. There are a couple of side stories involving a girl Neil's trying to track down, not to mention a tacked-on climax involving a runaway serial killer that has nothing to do with the rest of the film, but neither one of these really stops the enjoyment factor. I actually had a chance to briefly talk to Amy Johnson about the film, asking her why, with such a great cast, the movie didn't do a lot of business, and she just explained that with independent films, you never know exactly who will be interested in what project. That's really a shame, because Interstate 60, with all its quirks, is something special. Number 93. I know this one usually isn't considered one of Spielberg's best, but in my opinion, it's one of the last great Spielberg fantasy films before he started giving us more gritty, somber flicks like Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. It's not perfect. The Lost Boys, with their constant shouts of "Bang-a-ring," for one thing. What is Bang-a-ring? Is Bang-a-ring a thing, or was it invented for this movie? It also has its share of whimsy, corny moments. Did we really need to see Toodles flying off into the sky at the end of the film? Such a weird way to end the movie. I remember hearing about this film back when it initially came out, and even when I went to see it in theaters, I still didn't exactly know what it was. But the idea of what would happen if Peter Pan got old, it's such a high concept. Robin Williams was a perfect choice for the role. He's one of those actors who I think can pull off drama just as well as he pulls off comedy, and the role calls for both.
Those are my kids, and Hook is going to kill them unless we do something. Help me.
Dustin Hoffman is mesmerizing as Hook.
I like it. I like it. I like it. Oh, Smee, what a superb idea I've just had.
Both actors play up their characters to a degree, but just look at those set pieces. How could you take this movie as anything more than a contemporary fairy tale? Not to mention, if this movie were done today, you know this entire set would be done with CG. The set looks synthetic, it feels like a big movie set, but it also gives the film a charming visual aesthetic that reminds me of something you'd see in Goonies. It's all practical, and that makes it all the more effective. Of course, I can't forget Bob Hoskins as Smee.
Here comes Smee! Smee!
And Julia Roberts as Tinkerbell. An odd choice for sure, but I guess at this point Roberts was at the height of her career. The year before, she did Pretty Woman, which became one of the most popular romantic comedies of all time. I like the sexual tension between her and Peter, which was an element of these characters I never thought I'd get to explore. And I can't mention this film without noting the chemistry between Peter and his children, played by Charlie Korsmo and Amber Scott.
Run, Jack.
There are some pretty powerful moments, especially when Peter uses memories of his becoming a father to finally regain his power of flight. John Williams' score soars, as always, and again, the film relies more on practical set pieces and costumes than it does on special effects. It's a mesmerizing fantasy and the last of its kind, definitely underappreciated. Number 92. There were other buddy cop films before this, but this one seemed to really nail the formula. Coming off the success of the Mad Max trilogy, Mel Gibson plays psycho cop Martin Riggs, who goes off the rails after his wife dies. He constantly endangers himself, throwing himself in the middle of gunfights, jumping off buildings with potential suicide victims, and shooting most of the people he's supposed to be questioning.
You ever met anybody you didn't kill?
Well, I haven't killed you yet.
He's the opposite of Danny Glover's character Roger Murtaugh, a middle-aged family man on the edge of retirement who gets stuck with Riggs against his will.
I'm too old for this shit.
All of the Lethal Weapon films are fairly light on plot, but what makes them stand out is their focus on family. Of course, thanks to the Fast and the Furious films, that idea seems a little outdone, but when it comes to these movies, the family moments are what I remember the most. Even in later installments, when the family members tend to get relegated to cameos, there's still a sense that they're the driving force behind Riggs and Murtaugh's decisions. Watching Riggs get adopted by Murtaugh's family in the original film gives a sense of warmth to an otherwise pretty edgy action flick that centers on a heavy-handed plot dealing with heroin and ex-mercenaries. There are little things that makes this movie stand out, like the all-too-recognizable Michael Kamen score that carries throughout the rest of the series. As an 80s action flick, it also manages to keep the action scenes simple. When was the last time you saw an action sequence involve a simple gun shootout? The relationship between Riggs and Murtaugh is where the film really shines, and in many ways, it's the most potent in the original film.
If you think I'm gonna eat the world's lousiest Christmas turkey by myself, you're crazy.
I'll tell you a little secret.
What?
I'm not crazy.
I know.
It's always a treat to watch, whether on Christmas or any given day. The essential buddy cop movie. Number 91. The Back to the Future trilogy has to be one of the most well-made and consistent movie trilogies of all time. Watching these films back to back, it almost feels like all three of them were filmed at the same time, even though Robert Zemeckis had no intention of making sequels beyond that original movie. Part 3 suffers the curse of being the third film, which, according to most moviegoers, is usually never as good as the first two installments. We'll get to that later. We've got a lot of movies to get through. While it is my least favorite in the trilogy, there are moments that outshine the other films. This has a lot of highs, the biggest being Doc Brown's falling in love with school teacher Clara Clayton. The chemistry between Christopher Lloyd and Mary Steenburgen is very believable. Before this point, we don't know a lot about the Doc character, aside from the fact that he invented a time machine. Making him the center of this film was a clever idea, and while it certainly wasn't the most popular decision, seeing him outside of his comfort zone is one of the film's best aspects.
Marty! I gave you explicit instructions not to come here, but to go directly back to 1985.
I know, Doc. I had to come.
But it's good to see you, Marty.
I also love that Doc has to make a tough decision, having to choose between science and his personal feelings for Clara.
Doc, you're a scientist. So you tell me, what's the right thing to do up here?
When Doc talks about destroying his time machine because it's brought him nothing but disaster, you feel it in his performance. This is the first time Doc feels the emotional repercussions of time travel, and I find myself getting emotionally invested in a character that up until this point was just a fun plot device used to get Marty back to the present time. Then you have the train robbery at the end of the film, which is such a fun throwback to old westerns. That whole sequence is mesmerizing. Add to that the dilemma of rescuing Clara, and you have what could be one of the greatest sequences in the whole trilogy.
What's wrong, dude? You yellow?
The film also brings full circle Marty's inability to shrug off being called a chicken, which was a thread that started in Part 2. Seeing him face off against Mad Dog is another incredibly satisfying moment. Yeah, it's the third time we've seen a Tannen relative get dumped on by manure, but it never gets old.
Get him out of that shit.
Another standout scene, the town festival. For one, the awkwardness between Doc and Clara is just plain fun to watch. You believe that this is the first time either one of these characters has been in love, so their reactions to the situation are completely believable. Also, I love Marty's reaction when he sees that the wily Doc Brown, who is full of technobabble and scientific theories, can actually dance.
Funny boy!
Doc can dance.
In many ways, it's the best of the trilogy. The only two things holding it back are, one, it takes a while to really get on its feet. The stuff where Marty wakes up in Doc's home, finds out Doc dies in the Wild West, and plans to go back in time to save him, I could do without all that stuff. Second, as far as the setting goes, the Wild West established in this film feels more like a Hollywood set than an actual location, which is simply not the case in the original film, where the 1950s felt genuine. Even with those minor gripes, it carries over all the quirky humor and the fun of its predecessors and is a fitting end to a near-flawless trilogy.